Welcome to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I'm your host, Hope Bohannick, and today we have a very special reoccurring guest, Erin Wing. Erin was back on the show in 2021. It was our 18th episode. We're over 100 episodes now. And I'm having her on again to further her story of being an undercover investigator. And now she is managing and guiding other investigators. And I really wanted to hear more about that. Erin and other investigators, to me, are really the bravest and strongest among us in the animal advocacy movement. It's such an important and critical role getting the images of what is truly happening to these animals. They, to me, are the true heroes among the humans who speak out for animals. I admire Erin's work so much, all that she has done and accomplished. And I also invited her on the show again because she's going to be speaking at our upcoming Eugene Vegan Fest, just about a month away now on May 4th. If you're in the Pacific Northwest area, please join us. First ever inaugural Eugene Vegan Fest. I'm so grateful that Erin is going to be coming down to Eugene, Oregon from Washington State to present in our Impact Room. Tickets are on sale now, and I will have a link in the show notes for more information. So, I wanted to offer just a quick commentary before we get into the interview. I finally watched Wicked. Wicked is the movie of the Broadway musical, the movie version of the Broadway musical. And it's been out for a little bit, but the rental price reduced to $6, which felt more reasonable. And so I finally watched it. And I love musicals, but I really didn't know anything about this story other than that it was the backstory of the Witches of Oz from The Wizard of Oz. But wow, I was really blown away at the racial and speciesist commentary. It was pretty blatant. It was really blatant that it was about race. Alphaba becomes the Wicked Witch of the West, this young girl Alphaba, young woman Alphaba, and her being green was a metaphor for a person of color. It was pretty obvious. And Glinda, her friend, who of course becomes Glinda the Good Witch, is a friend of hers in school, was obviously the privileged white girl. I had heard this critique before, like in writings I had read about it in articles about the witch and her being green and this being a kind of a metaphor for people of color. But I didn't know that Wicked, this musical, went there and incorporated that into the story. And then there was this other element of the animals. The animals of Oz were professors at the school and could speak and were interacting with the people and were just part of the society, but they were being oppressed and they were being pushed out. And there was this scene, all right, spoiler alert here, I'm going to get into details, but there was a scene where a goat professor is teaching a class, and there was a demeaning message that had been written on the board and was uncovered that said animals should be seen and not heard. And the professor was obviously shaken, right? So the animals were losing their ability to speak. That was kind of part of this whole process of the animals being oppressed. And I felt like this was kind of like a metaphor for speciesism. And it was more kind of like the people of Oz were losing their ability to hear them or understand them. So a metaphor for not hearing the animals, not trying to know what they were saying or what they need or what they're suffering because of us. It was really interesting. Then near the end, Alphaba had wanted to see the wizard because she wanted to ask him to make her not green, to make her like everyone else, right? So she wouldn't be different. But then she gets there, she changes her mind, and she makes a selfless decision to ask the wizard to help the animals, right? To ask for help for what's happening to the animals. Was this all in the books? I never read the books as a child. I guess there's like 14 books in this series. I just looked it up. Was this whole animal part in the books. I mean, this was animal activism. I was very surprised. I'm really surprised that I haven't heard more about it from vegan corners, like that no one's really talking about it, at least in the vegan circles that I'm in. So it's worth a watch. Check out Wicked. I was really blown away by all the social justice and animal rights symbolism. Pretty cool. Okay, let's now get into our interview with Erin. Okay, so today's guest is Erin Wing. She is currently serving as the Deputy Director of Investigations for Animal Outlook and previously worked as an undercover investigator. Over the course of 2 years, she went on to complete 4 investigations in dairy, chicken, and aquaculture industries, including the first ever undercover expose of salmon aquaculture in the US. Her work has been featured in the Washington Post, The Guardian, and the New York Times. Welcome to the podcast, Erin.
Thanks for having me. It's really great to be back.
That's right. That's right. This is your second appearance. We're really happy to have you back. The first time you were on the show was 2021. So it's been a few years, and we're really excited to hear what you have been up to. Last time you told us a lot about your undercover work, which is so amazing to hear. But what have you been up to lately? And I know now you're kind of overseeing investigators, but tell us what you've been up to since you were last on the show.
The investigations haven't stopped at Animal Outlook, so I'm still very much involved in investigations, but now in a different capacity. And since 2021, in my role as Deputy Director of Investigations, working alongside our Director of Investigations, Scott David, we've exposed about 10 more animal agriculture facilities and institutions for systemic cruelty and abuse if inflicted on farmed animals across the country. And one of our most recent investigations of a Tyson contracted chicken farming facility in Virginia resulted in the farm owner and manager of the facility pleading guilty to multiple counts of animal cruelty we uncovered during our investigation and led to the farm itself closing down. So that was
Wow.
a recent victory that, yeah, it's there's so many things I could talk about with that, but just to sort of be a little bit concise with what
Give
I've
an
been up
overview.
to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Aside from that, I am also on the board of directors for another animal advocacy organization focused on using legal strategies to challenge unlawful conduct in farming and experimentation called Animal Partisan, which was actually founded by a phenomenal lawyer who I had the pleasure of working with during his time at Animal Outlook. And I've been a volunteer at farmed animal sanctuaries for several years in Oregon and most recently in Washington State, where I now live with my partner, who is a live-in caretaker at Heartwood Haven, a wonderful pig sanctuary where I wake up every morning and look out my window and see a community of pigs healing from neglect and trauma, free to
Hmm.
roam these vast pastures or forage in this extensive wooded area that they call
Wow.
home.
Wow.
So, yeah, I feel like I've grown as an advocate for animals. I've made it a personal mission to increase my understanding of the people I advocate for as much as possible. And now more than ever, I recognize the importance of fostering the animal rights community that has been built over many decades, valuing collaboration and empowering more people to take the first step toward what will hopefully be a long journey of helping animals. And for some people, that first step starts with a deep dive into the world of undercover investigations and animal cruelty. And I've dedicated myself to helping former investigators transform that experience into what will hopefully be a long career in
Hmm.
animal rights work.
Wow. Wow. Well, there was so much there I want to ask you about. But yeah, we'll get to a lot of this and try to unpack all of that more. But I wanted to ask you about the investigations and that work. And when you were on the show last, you told us about a lot of these investigative projects that you were on, and what you saw and what you experienced. And now you're kind of managing and mentoring others that are going in and doing the undercover investigative work. And I'm just curious, how that's going, how what that entails, how it's different maybe. And I'm sure it's challenging in new ways.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just interesting to me because, this is such a hidden world, even in the activist community, much less the larger population. We just don't really know what's going on, or how this all works. When someone sees video or footage or a still of the cruelty, the animal cruelty, and it's
Hmm.
so powerful and it's so effective for people to truly know what's going on, we don't think about who was behind the camera, who was there in
Yeah.
that place. And that's the world you live in. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I'm actually really grateful to have the perspective of someone who was an undercover investigator for 2 years. And I think it's been really crucial in managing field investigators. It's a really niche job,
Yeah.
a very niche job, and I can definitely understand how a lot of people don't really think about, who's the person who's going into these spaces. And when it comes to managing field investigators, I think what I've learned is that everyone navigates it differently and navigates this job in different ways. And you have to be a certain type of person to handle this kind of work in the animal advocacy space. It's a specialty position, and there are specific types of mindsets that are best suited for it. My mindset in particular was always one of complete selflessness. And I have to admit that I did have an ego when I first started doing undercover work. And after my first investigation, I felt very empowered. And in my case, it had an adverse effect. I wasn't really prepared to deal with things not going my way in the field. And that often happens in the investigation space. And when you talk about the single images that are really compelling that undercover investigators manage to get, no one really knows all of the work and all of the struggle that is behind those
Yeah.
singular images that
Yeah.
really are super compelling, that tell the whole story. It's really difficult, that journey to get to that imagery of what the animals endure on farms and in spaces like those. And that's when resilience is very key in undercover work. And cultivating my resilience really helped to keep me going when I was undercover, even when investigations work became very challenging. And those lessons I learned from being on the ground and being out there doing the work, I took those lessons, and now that informs how I provide guidance to other investigators and other advocates. And just having this emphasis on resilience being so key to animal advocacy work in general. And I've only been doing this for 7 years, but I mean, how long have you been doing this work, Hope?
Well, like 30, but certainly in a different capacity.
Yeah, and this
Yeah.
movement has been around since what, the 1970s, or
Yeah.
and the animals still aren't free. And not to be pessimistic, but there's a point to be made when thinking about this in the framework of resilience, right? I'm really humbled when I think of the work that has already been done and how long everybody else, incredibly resilient advocates like you, have been doing this work for, because we all believe in the cause and we show up for the animals every day,
Yeah.
year after year, in the hope that we can make the slightest bit of difference in their liberation. And most importantly, in my case, I do it because I have seen them at their worst, in the worst conditions, and seen them endure the worst abuses that our world has normalized for so long. And I can't imagine a reality for myself where I go back to ignoring them, or a reality where I don't try as hard as I can for them. And I think that's my biggest takeaway from doing investigations work, is that the most important contribution that investigators give to the animal rights movement is seeing the animals at their worst and putting ourselves through the worst suffering we've probably ever endured in our lives, as the people doing the work. And there's a mental, physical, emotional strain like you wouldn't believe, and continuing to try to, at the very least, make sure those animals are seen. So when you're looking at the massive scale of a single farm and knowing you can't save any of the animals there as an undercover investigator, and you know that most likely all of them will be killed, and the wheel of suffering is going to continue to spin. And instead of deciding to just go back to your regular life, you say, you know what? It's hard, it's sad, but I'm going to keep trying anyway. And
Mm,
that's the most important thing I try to talk with investigators and advocates about is cultivating resilience, having the capacity to continue to try, even when things don't go the way we want them to, even when the world we live in isn't ideal and the odds are against us and probably will be for a very, very long time. We try and try and try again. Investigators have to have that iron will to keep going back into those hellscapes of just unimaginable anguish and keep trying as long as they can.
yeah. Wow. Yeah. Yeah, it's generational work. It's a
Mhm.
lifetime of work. That's what I remind myself daily of, that, we may not see the results of our efforts, even in our lifetimes. And you just have to sit with that. You have to be okay with that and know that the work is important, even if you can't see the results, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, that's tough. And yeah, I can't imagine being, it's so hard for so many of us to even look at the video footage, to
Mhm.
even watch, and to imagine that someone is actually living in it, working in it, living in it, day in and day out to get that footage. And I went back and I listened to our interview, our conversation from your 2021 episode. You said something like video can't convey the full experience, right?
Yeah.
The things that you experience, actually being there, like the smell and the
Mhm.
sounds and other senses beyond the video, that you experience as an investigator. It's just so powerful.
Yeah, it's those are the things that really stay with you. I mean, I can't speak for everybody, and I'm not sure what impacts other undercover investigators, but across the board from other people that I've spoken with who have done this work, those are the things that really you don't forget the smell of a pig farming facility.
Yeah.
It's one of the most intense, and just being in community with everybody and now in 2025, very different from 2021, where back then I didn't really wasn't tapped into the community of my fellow advocates, but now getting to know more people who have done this work, even though we're sort of scattered everywhere, we find that we sort of have similar experiences and we trade these stories about, oh yeah, when it comes to the farms that maybe have a distinct smell. Like we talk about that, we remember it, or particular experiences that might be unique to particular farm sites, depending on what their standard practices are. These are perspectives that I think are so valuable to have in the movement. And I'm really grateful to sort of be connected to others who have had these experiences.
Yeah, and I'll mention here that you're going to be coming and speaking for us at our upcoming first ever Eugene Vegan Fest in Eugene, Oregon. I'm so grateful that you're going to be able to come and present there, and you'll be able to kind of maybe show some of the images that you captured and talk more about it, and really get a sense of what you experienced. So I encourage anyone that's in the Pacific Northwest area to come to our Eugene Vegan Fest and hear Erin talking about her investigations. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, very excited about it. Looking
Good.
forward to it.
Good. Yeah, yeah. So I'm interested to hear now maybe about the industry itself, and what you may have discovered about the industry doing this work for so many years. I mean, I pretty much know that when, there's never been an investigation where you go in and you're like, oh, wow, everything's all great. And it's so
Yeah.
clean and the animals are happy and wow,
Mhm.
nothing to see here, right? I mean, that just
Yeah,
doesn't happen.
never.
So, so I'm curious to hear about that, kind of like what you've discovered about the industry. And you said you had like a positive outcome recently with a facility actually being shut down, which is
Yeah.
amazing. I'd love to hear more about that. Yeah, it can be frustrating sometimes when, you put so much work and effort and energy and sacrifice into these investigations, and there's a lot of media attention or a press release, all of that. And then, then what? And then it may be some lower level workers who really are just caught up in a horrible system are let go, and the company
Hmm.
can say, oh, it's just a few bad apples. So that sometimes the outcome is frustrating to me
Yeah.
as an observer. So this is great to hear that you had such a good outcome. Can you talk a little about all of that?
Yes, definitely. So I think undercover investigators really, really understand that frustration that comes when you spend 3 or 6 months at a facility seeing abuse day in and day out. And after the fact, maybe like a year or so down the line, you think about that farm site after you've left and maybe started the next undercover investigation at a different facility. And you think back and wonder, what's happened to that place? Is it still operating? So, from my experience doing undercover work, over the course of 2 years, I investigated 4 different facilities, and only one of those places was not able to work with animals anymore. And all the other ones, the 3 other facilities, they're still operating.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's the painful reality of advocating for farmed animals because they don't have any protections under our current laws, really. They're very flimsy at best. Chickens don't have any federal protections at all.
Yeah.
And it's really unfortunate to see the indifference to their suffering when we submit materials to law enforcement, when we have these really long, arduous back and forths with law enforcement, just pleading with them to look at the evidence. It's right there. It's plain and clear. And it's really hard to come to terms with how indifferent people outside of the movement are to animal suffering, even when it's right there in front of them, right in their faces,
Wow.
through hours and hours of evidence. So it's an unfortunate reality of conducting undercover investigations. We do what we can. And I think I can definitely go into sort of where I've adjusted my approach to investigations work based off of those experiences and seeing, you know, maybe things haven't worked out in the past, but things can always be improved, especially when it comes to my advocacy work and how I conduct investigations and manage investigations. And for our approach at Animal Outlook, what you mentioned was that in the past, we've just seen low-level workers like taking the hit and taking the fall for these really large corporations. So I think that was what the difference was. And I think a key turning point for us was this investigation that we released recently into a chicken farm contracted to Tyson Foods. So for example, this was sort of a full circle moment for me because about 10 years ago, I was a new undercover investigator ending my first investigation and leaving a chicken farm contracted to Tyson Foods. And I was just crying as I drove away from the farm site where I documented some of the most brutal abuse I've ever seen. And I was just staring at the rearview mirror, thinking of all the young birds I was leaving behind, and I didn't know what was going to happen to them. And our newer investigation was of a Tyson contracted chicken farm just a couple of hours away from where my first investigation took place.
Hmm.
So that whole case was just like a bit of vindication for me. It was a full circle moment. And during that investigation, returning to where it all started, but being in a different position as a manager of investigations, I wanted to make sure I did everything I could for the chickens there. And I leveraged my experience to do that. I also dug deeper into the chicken industry to fully understand these faulty standards that they operate by. I used the knowledge I acquired from my time working on a chicken farm and through additional research I conducted into chicken farming practices since then. I was able to apply all of that knowledge of animal agriculture to the investigation. I knew what the standard practices were and how those practices could lead to animal suffering. And throughout that entire process, I learned how important it is to keep putting the pressure on these farms, even when things don't necessarily go our way. Because chances are, when we do get access to these places and we do get the opportunity to document the animal suffering, things will be just as bad, if not worse, than maybe they happen to be 10 years ago. And contrary to what the animal agriculture industry wants consumers to believe, their practices are just as cruel than they were in the past. And there's no right way to do the wrong thing. There's no right way to harm and exploit animals for profit or personal gain. And consumers are manipulated into believing that these big corporations like Tyson's Foods care about the animals, and they really just care about their bottom line and whatever they have to do to convince people to purchase these products.
Yeah.
They have so many protections, so many things that work more so in their favor than for the animals. But instead of just looking at those as obstacles, instead of being discouraged, I just always think day after day, what can I do differently? How can I use all the tools that I have at my disposal to be a better advocate for animals, to attack the system in a different way, and maybe adjust my approach, maybe rethink some things and dig deeper into understanding animal agriculture. So the next time I have this really rare opportunity to be able to manage an investigation into an animal agriculture facility, I do everything I can to make sure that these animals get justice, the justice that they deserve.
So I wanted to ask you about something that you kind of mentioned earlier. You were talking about how the industry kind of puts on a facade for the public and consumers. And, we have our Humane Hoax Project where we talk
Mhm.
about the humane labels on meat, dairy, and eggs. And I'm curious if any of your investigations at Animal Outlook where you've looked into any farms that have alternative labels. There's a lot of different labels that are being used to appease consumers, make people feel better about the industry, especially because we are now exposing them because of the last 10 years of undercover investigations. These labels have really skyrocketed. I'm curious if you've done any investigations of farms with alternative labels or websites that have images or descriptions that are completely different than what you found. Do you want to talk about that a little?
Yes, definitely. Actually, one of our latest investigations was into foster farms, and we exposed chicken catchers throwing, kicking birds, running over live chickens with forklifts
Oh,
on multiple farms. While Foster Farms claims all of its farms are American Humane certified.
right.
And
Yeah.
Foster Farms' website claims that the chickens they exploit and profit from enjoy the five freedoms, including freedom from discomfort, freedom from injury, pain, and disease, and freedom from fear and distress. And our undercover investigator, who worked as a chicken catcher for Foster Farms, documented chickens covered in mud due to poor conditions on multiple farms, chickens running away from workers in fear for their lives as they were snatched up by their legs and forcefully thrown into metal crates to be sent to slaughter. So,
Hmm.
what freedoms did they have? Confined by the thousands in windowless sheds, never seeing the outside world for 47 days. and being sent to die without having any choice in the matter. And one of our investigations was able to expose that. And in our Tyson investigation, we exposed how there are those involved in the animal agriculture industry who find their consumers gullible and laugh about how people fall for their manipulation tactics. So
Really?
during our investigation into the chicken meat farm contracted to Tyson Foods, we documented this representative for Tyson Foods and the manager of the facility mocking the perception of free-range farming. They laughed about the concept of free-range chickens, with the Tyson representative telling the manager, "Those birds don't go outside. You know that." And she went on to say, free range, look that up online, free range, they only have access to the outside for like an hour a day or 30 minutes a day or something like that. Those were her words. And the
Mm.
manager called out the commercials and advertisements that portray this false reality, saying they make it like they all come out and enjoy the sun. And then the Tyson representative then cut in and said, that is strictly for commercial purposes. They pick out the prettiest birds and they toss them out in the grass. And that was from a Tyson representative.
Wow.
They're
Wow.
telling us that it's all for show.
Yeah. My God. Wow. That's really, really telling. So amazing that, they just know. They just know that it's all
Yeah.
lies. It's all for marketing. Yeah. Wow. Well, yeah, I'm not surprised, I'm not surprised because we know. We know that it is all just like you said, a facade. It's what they want consumers to believe. But, I'm so grateful that you and your team are exposing what the truth is. And American Certified Humane, you mentioned that certification label. Butterball Turkey also uses American Certified Humane, and
Mhm.
they're the largest turkey producer in the US with whatever millions of birds. And I talk about them in my book, actually, in The Humane Hoax, my anthology. I have a whole section about American Certified Humane and Butterball Turkey and all of the horrors that the turkeys endure and how it means so little. These certifications mean nothing. It's really,
Yeah.
really frustrating. Yeah. Something else you said about, the chickens being covered in mud and that they're claiming that they're free from discomfort and all
Mhm.
of that. And I think some people might think, oh, well, whatever, they're animals. Animals are out in the mud all the time. No big deal, right? But for chickens, actually, they like to be very clean. All of the
Yeah.
animals, the animals like, especially chickens, like to be clean. They
Mhm.
preen their feathers constantly all day, and they do dust baths and water baths to clean themselves. Right? Birds are often bathing in water to clean themselves. So, this idea that, oh, well, they've got a little mud on them, big deal. It is uncomfortable. We know that we're uncomfortable when we're dirty. When you're dirty, and especially if you're covered in mud, you
Yeah.
feel very uncomfortable, right? So, there's things that people don't understand about animals and make assumptions that it's no big deal for them. When actually it's incredibly, not just uncomfortable, but can be, a degree of suffering.
Yeah, I think that's also why I've made it sort of a priority for me to, even as someone who worked undercover on farm sites and saw farmed animals in this specific setting where they're being exploited, they have none of the enrichments that are natural for them to express natural behaviors. It is completely unnatural for thousands and thousands of birds to be crammed into a dark shed on dirt floors, relieving themselves on these floors. And they're crammed in by the thousands. That's so overwhelming. And not to be able to dust bathe. They don't have the ability to do that on chicken farms. the animal agriculture industry wants us to believe that this is natural, that this is typical, and it is not.
Yeah.
And to go from environments like that, I came away from those spaces knowing that I didn't have the full picture of what farmed animals are really like. So that's why I took it upon myself to, even though I was in those facilities with them and interacting with them on daily basis, it wasn't enough. I needed to understand how they behave naturally. What are they really like when they have the capacity to express all of these behaviors that are necessary for them to be well and to express these behaviors that are so natural for them. I am really grateful that I was able to experience that through visiting sanctuaries, volunteering at sanctuaries, and seeing these animals free. And seeing how different it is from
Yeah.
how these farmed animals are treated and how they have to live. They're forced to live horrible, miserable lives on these farm sites.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about farmed sanctuaries. I believe farmed animal sanctuaries are just so important, so critical to the movement, just for what you just said. So we can see and experience the animals in in how they truly should be. Not only, I mean, well, of course, having these animals, the ones that are rescued, to be able to live their lives out, that's enough. That's, reason enough to have animal sanctuaries. But also, as just, people outside of knowing animals, it's important for, I think, us to be able to recognize and see these animals in their natural state, doing natural behaviors, being able to live in a happy, a cheerful, as Karen Davis would say about chickens, that they are cheerful birds. And you go into a facility or see these images in cage free, even, but egg facilities. This is not a cheerful. You do not see the word cheerful would not at all be described for these birds. I mean, you can see the misery. And I think people don't understand that they have the capacity to be cheerful, to be happy, to live free. And farmed animal sanctuaries provide that opportunity for us to witness that, right?
Yeah.
And you've seen both sides. You've seen both in the industry, seeing what happens to these animals, how they are in these places of horror in the meat, dairy, and egg industry. And then you've also seen farmed sanctuaries. And I believe you're now living on a farmed sanctuary in
Yes.
Washington State. Yeah. So I'd love to hear about that. Tell us what sanctuary it is, where you're living, and what it's like to live on a farmed animal sanctuary, and that contrast, maybe, from the investigative work to be living on a farm sanctuary.
Yeah. So I currently, and I think, this was always a dream of mine, to live on a sanctuary and to actually be able to say that I do now. It's still hard for me to believe, right? It's like a dream come true for me.
Oh,
So yeah, my partner and I currently live at Heartwood Haven in Roy, Washington, and it is a pig sanctuary. And I can't really stress the importance of how critical it has been for me to, um, after doing undercover work, to spend my time on farmed animal sanctuaries. And when it comes to learning about how to process trauma, my greatest teachers have been animals.
hmm.
While I've only witnessed what they're subjected to in animal agriculture for brief periods of time, they actually live those experiences. They're on the receiving end of so much abuse and hardship. And I've learned a lot about how to navigate that world of suffering and sadness from them. And their understanding of this world is greater than I can fathom. They are capable of such forgiveness. They live in the now, and they have no reason to open themselves up to human affection, considering all the things that humans have done to them. They have no reason to be vulnerable to us, but they do give us that chance. And I was given that chance to rebuild my relationship with farmed animals at a sanctuary. And it took me 2 years after retiring from being an undercover investigator for me to realize that animal agriculture had really fractured my connection with farmed animals. Throughout the 2 years I worked undercover, I had developed this wall separating myself from getting too close to the animals I documented on farms
Mm.
because that was my way of protecting myself. And another part of me felt that I wasn't worthy of their friendship anymore, not after working on the same farms that perpetuated their suffering, even if it was ultimately to be their witness and seek justice for them. The work I performed on farms that these farms had a hand in exploiting these animals that left a really deep stain on me that I could not get out. So when a colleague of mine invited me to volunteer at a sanctuary in Oregon, which is Wildwood Farm Sanctuary and Preserve in Newberg, Oregon, after I retired from my undercover work, I went there and I was afraid to touch the animals there.
Hmm.
But when I was hesitant to approach the cows, the chickens, they taught me that my hands are capable of being gentle and kind and respectful to them. They had to teach me, the specific ways that they were open to being touched, the right ways to interact with them. And my first interactions with farmed animals had taken place in environments where, unfortunately, there was a power dynamic where animals were just products on an assembly line at these animal agriculture facilities while I was undercover. But at farmed animal sanctuaries, I was able to have these positive interactions with them and see them being free and happy and just existing. And that is the beauty of what animals give to us in the connections we form with them. No matter what we've done or where we come from, what we've been through, as long as we approach them with kindness, they offer acceptance, even when we think we least deserve it.
Mm.
So, yeah, as I've been
Wow.
navigating this journey of healing from trauma, it's been such a tremendous gift to be able to do that with animals at sanctuaries, to see them also healing as a community together. And all of these individuals come from traumatic backgrounds, and I see them thriving and surviving, and it's such an inspiration to me. I can't thank them enough for the gift that they've given me, that I can just witness that. And in their interactions with me, the trust they give me, it reminds me every time I see them that I'm not broken and our relationship between animals and humans is not broken. That connection is still there. And no matter what powers try to break it, we will always be here for each other.
Aw. Oh, that's beautiful. So beautifully said. And wow, yeah, it hurts me. It breaks my heart that, you had this feeling that you didn't feel deserving of their affection just because of the work you did. The work you did was courageous and amazing for them, So I
Mhm.
know you're probably working through all that, and I know we can't help sometimes feeling guilt over things that even aren't our fault.
Yeah,
But wow, it's amazing that you're there. I love that you're able to live with them, and it is incredible to me how forgiving animals can be, right? How,
yeah.
I mean, even animals that were put through some of the most horrible things at the hands of humans, and then they come to a sanctuary. Of course, they're scared at first, and of course, they think they're just going to receive pain from
Hmm.
humans. But then, when they're offered love, when they're offered kindness, they will forgive. They will
Hmm.
forgive. And so they recognize that we are all individuals, that humans have different capacities, and some humans uh, are not as kind, and some will be incredibly kind. So why can't we recognize in them that they too are individuals, so individual, and have such individual personalities and different characterizations and ways of being, and they recognize that in us, I would think that that is an indicator that they are individuals too, and we should recognize that in them, right?
Yeah, I think the animal agriculture industry has done a lot of work with just trying to sever that tie that is inherent in us. There's so many children who just innately love animals. And I mean, I've never really met a kid who hasn't had shown some affection or said they love cats or dogs or and when it comes to just extending our compassion, there's been this brick wall that the animal ag industry has tried to construct between us and farmed animals and
Mm,
extending that same compassion towards them because they've categorized them as you care about cats and dogs, but these animals, they're for human consumption. And they've drilled that into so many people's brains that they can't really um, break out of that manipulation tactic because it
yeah.
really is just a manipulation tactic to increase profits and so that people don't feel as bad when they're going to purchase the carcasses of these animals and don't think about their suffering and how they're suffering just for the sake of being in a supermarket where somebody can pick up that meat and eat it so that these larger corporations can then profit from those purchases. And that's what it really is just an exchange of all of these lives of these animals who have the capacity to experience all this pain and anguish. And they have the capacity to also be happy and show affection, but they're not able to do that as freely as they could when they're just tied and bound to this concept of being considered as other, as less than, as these species that we should feel justified in exploiting, no matter how much they suffer, no matter how much pain is inflicted on them. And the animal ag industry has done such a good job with trying to sever that connection. And I think that's where these sanctuaries come into play, where people can actually interact with cows and chickens and pigs and actually see them and see that they have personalities, that two chickens might not be the same in personality. One might be a little bit more friendly and one might be a little more standoffish, but they have the right to those personalities and expressing those personalities. And it's a gift for us to be able to interact with them that way, where they are able to express themselves in an environment where they're not being exploited. And that's where we can really rebuild that connection. I really feel like I've been able to repair that that bond and that connection that was inherent in me since childhood.
Yeah.
And now it's been reforged. And I think now it's even stronger than ever.
Aw, that's wonderful. I love it. I love to hear that, and I'm so glad you've found a place at a sanctuary to be there and be with the animals. It's wonderful to hear that, and I encourage everybody to, find your local sanctuary, take a trip there, bring friends, go and experience the animals and support and visit wherever your local farmed animal sanctuary is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Erin, I mentioned it earlier, but you're going to be speaking at our upcoming Eugene Vegan Fest, very first ever Eugene Vegan Fest in Eugene, Oregon on May 4th, 2025. And I just wanted to ask you actually about Veg Fest. Do you like Veg Fests? I'm sure you've gone to a few. What do you think about Veg Fest and what are you looking forward to?
Yeah, I love Veg Fest. I love just being in community with a lot of people, even, just seeing people who are pre-vegan learn more about our fellow earthlings and think about animals, consider changing their diets, being exposed to a lot of this information that otherwise they wouldn't be exposed to because it's not really covered in popular mainstream media. Every now and then it will be, but here are these havens that are created in the form of veg fests. And, I'm super excited for Eugene Vegan Fest. I can't wait. And just knowing that there's going to be, an additional haven for people to go into this space and be open to learning more about how their food choices might affect others in a variety of different ways. You're exposed to all of these different ideas and people who have been eating vegan for quite some time and are healthy and happier because they can sit down and look at their plate of food in front of them and feel like I don't have any guilt. This is
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
guilt-free. I don't have the body of somebody on my plate.
Yeah.
It's a really wonderful feeling, and I am really glad for VegFest to give people the chance to be able to have that feeling when they sit down to eat the next time that they decide to have a meal. I feel like Veg Fests ultimately just empower people to recognize their own capacity to make better choices with their diet and to choose vegan. So I'm very grateful for those spaces and the samples, free samples of
Oh,
food and
yes. And the free samples.
can't get
Yeah.
enough of that. And supporting local vegan businesses too, that show up to Veg Fest. And then, of course, ultimately to just be in community with like-minded people who are all compassionate, who are all there to help animals. Really, really grateful to have those spaces and happy that Eugene will be able to have that space now.
Yeah, we're really excited. The community has stepped up and just been so, so excited and supportive. And so I think it's going to be great. And I'm so glad you're going to be coming down for it. I can't
Yeah.
wait. Yeah. Cool. Well, Erin, thank you so much for your time today. And I'm going to wrap up with our last question. And that is, what gives you hope for the future?
It's a really great question. I always like thinking about that concept, right? Because I do have a lot of hope for our future, despite all the things that I've seen in my time as an animal rights advocate. I've seen animals endure so much and seen the worst of what people can be capable of. But I still remember that while there are many people, many people who do prioritize their own self-interest, regardless of whether those choices result in the suffering and exploitation of others, like the owners of these massive corporations that profit from farms and all those connected to them. There's still good people in the world, and even in the face of a lot of hardship, a lot of anguish, I can still recognize that. And for my line of work, and I think for a lot of animal rights advocates, it's not it's not easy to engage with suffering. It's not easy to confront structures and institutions of power. It's not profitable. It's not fun. It's hard work. It's uncomfortable. There's a lot of failure in it in some capacity. It's hard to have people look you in the face and tell you point blank that they don't care about animals being tortured in our food systems, that they don't care about children working in slaughterhouses or rural communities being polluted by massive farms raising pigs or cows for meat sitting right in their backyards. But it is so much more fulfilling for me to know that I can look at the animals at sanctuaries, at this sanctuary that I live on, and I can say to them, I am doing all that I can. I see you, I am here for you, and I will keep trying no matter what, whether I encounter victory for you or defeat, even if I don't know how my actions will affect the system or that system, even if I can't quantify it or visually see the change myself, I will keep trying. And what gives me hope for the future is that I can feel those things and look at the community around me and see so many others doing the same thing. I sit down and I talk with you. I talk to so many other people who feel the same way because I can't do it on my own. And in recognizing that, I focus on empowering others to realize their own agency, to cultivate their own resilience, and encourage them when they feel like there's nothing they can do, to just do what they can to help, whether it's from behind a camera, behind a computer, behind a poster plastered with the face of a dying animal on a farm site that they hold up over their heads in the freezing cold or the blistering sun. Just try to do what you can. And I still see it every day we're all still here trying to see a better world. And that gives me hope.
Well, Erin, what gives me hope for the future is you. People like you, young people like you that are so dedicated, so courageous, and continuing this work, carrying on this work with so much passion. And yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for all that you do. And thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I would encourage you to also listen to Erin's first episode, episode 18, that we did back in 2021. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. She goes into detail of her investigations, and one of those was on a salmon farm. It was the first ever undercover investigation of a fish farm, of fish farming, and it was really eye opening. I encourage you to check that out. So, the next time you see some images, some video of animal suffering, of what the farmed animals endure, the next time you bear witness to the reality of their suffering, take a moment to think about who got that image, who shot that footage. They suffer too, to expose what we all need to see. I think this is kind of another area where there's human suffering along with the animal suffering, like the people that have to work in these places and in slaughterhouses. These jobs, both the jobs of working in these horrible places and having to go and expose these horrible places, all of this wouldn't exist. All of this trauma, all these horrible things that humans have to go through on both ends, on all sides of this industry, wouldn't have to exist if we would just stop eating animals and their bodily fluids. Remember that these investigators suffer too, to expose what we all need to see, what we all need to know. For them and for the animals, live vegan.